Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and today I'm going to talk about improving your game, getting better. It's one of the number one things I get asked on this channel, especially because on my channel I've spent so much time talking about list building and talking about sort of the metagame as a whole and the shapes of lists that are out there doing well. When list building is about half of winning in this game, in my opinion, and the other half is how you actually play. And there's a reason that I don't talk about it that much. I consider myself a much better strategist than a tactician. And so I like to do as much as I possibly can before the game to beat my opponents so that I don't have to rely on necessarily like quick, brilliant thinking during the game in order to win, because I'm just never going to be as good at that as I am at the other thing. Well, luckily, there are things you can do to improve your game outside of list building that still sort of rely on that strategic part of your brain as opposed to the tactical part of your brain. And that's what I'm going to talk about today and why I think it's the easiest way to improve, because tactics are something that you get better at either by just repetition or it's just something you're going to be kind of naturally good at. You're not necessarily going to be able to improve your tactics all that well just by hearing somebody talk about it. It's really something that improves via gameplay. But strategizing and planning out how you're going to play round one really can improve your gameplay, can improve your results, and can improve just about everything about your experience with Warcry. I think it can make Warcry more fun too. So let's talk about it. There's a lot of value to being really decisive in round one, and there's a few reasons for that. One is that round one is exponentially simpler than every other round. Things get simpler than in round four, but you don't have as much time to think about it. And the reason is there's not that many pieces on the board, and they are prescribed where they're going to be, right? So you can actually kind of solve round one, especially because there's often very concrete goals. And so having sort of a really decisive plan for what you're going to do round it can leave you more time to think later in rounds, which is really good. If you're playing a swarm warband, it can allow you to finish matches that you otherwise wouldn't even be able to finish because you'd just be taking too damn long moving your guys around. It's also just like a good courtesy thing for you and your opponents. I think something that happens a lot, especially when you're playing a lot of bodies, is you'll kind of accidentally clock hog, and you'll actually take a lot of time from your opponent, which is kind of discourteous. And so if you have your round ones really well practiced and planned out, then you can make things really quick. It also lets you maximize your early points scored. Later rounds are usually way easier if you've been maximizing your points early on in the game. Now, some missions that have come out lately from GW make that less true, and most of those missions suck, so I wouldn't worry about those. Unfortunately, if you play in the UK, you'll be playing those missions a lot, but hey, sucks to be you. It also lets you create better engagements for yourself in round two. And this is one of the biggest things, especially in those bad missions that I talked about. A lot of games are won and lost in the first two activations of round two. And even a lot of games that go down to the wire are still won and lost in those first two engagements. And it's like, getting lucky. The underdog getting lucky in that situation is the reason why we had a game, essentially, something like that. And so, or like, the first two activations can create a skewed field that then it's all about just not punting away your lead, right? So a lot can happen in those first two activations. And if you can set yourself up so that you can potentially win on the spot, depending on how those activations go, but there's nothing your opponent can really do to win on the spot in the first two activations of round two, that is one of the most powerful things you can do in all of Warcry. The last reason is if you're going to an event, any kind of thinking that you bank pre-game is mental energy you can put somewhere else during the game. And even if you're just hanging out with your buddies, if you've kind of put in some time to think about how your warband opens the game, that just leaves more time for talking and having fun, right? That way, if you know what you're going to do in round one, you can be chatting and having a good time and still kind of do something competent on the board round one. And I think that's really valuable too. So I'm going to do an example and kind of scheme out how you would plan out your opener for a mission. And we're going to be able to use that to extrapolate how you do this more generally. So the mission I'm going to use as an example is Swamp Raid. A few reasons I'm doing this. One is it is the first mission in Adepticon. Two is this is a pretty straightforward objective mission, which I think is nice, where there's only one deployment group on the board in round one. There's 4 objectives, but they're not put in very interesting places, which normally is something I would call a negative. But for something being the first mission of a big tournament with a lot of people who are on different experience levels, having something like that where things are simple and not that interesting is actually kind of valuable for showing people the game. One thing that I think is really important with if you're creating a library of missions is you should have missions with a lot of texture to them and missions with surprisingly little texture to them combined in your same group, because that creates more variety of play, and variety is the spice of life. There's a secondary on this mission. Essentially, you just score based on how many objectives you hold. The more, the better. I think this is a score 1, score 2, score more, but it would be when there's 4 objectives, it's not far off of being the same. The only issue is if you get 2 and they get 1, then you get just like a bonus point for some reason, which is pretty devastating. You do get 3 points if you take an objective that the opponent had last turn, which kind of functions as a bit of a catch-up mechanic. If they kind of swarm the board and take it 3-1 in the early turns, then you can get some catch-up points if you manage to sort of bring things back, which is kind of good for you. And it gives kind of extra scoring to the people who have the most staying power. I think that this is going to be good for simplifying. So when you think of it, you have 2 home objectives that are close to your round 1 deployment. And then there's 2 contested objectives, but the texture of these contested objectives is different because each team reinforces right next to one of the contested objectives. So if you think of yourself as, say, you're blue, you have your home objective, and then you have the contested objective that's going to be easy to hold later, and the contested objective that's going to be very hard to hold later. And then you think about the fact that your home objective could be under threat depending on what they decide to do with their hammer. So there's some really interesting decisions to make, even though there's not a lot of decisions to make. And I think that that's a great place to be. I do think that Swamp Raid is a very good round 1 mission to put in packs. So your goals, when you sort of think about how you're going to approach this, 1, you want to score your home objective. Most of the time, I'll talk about the situations where you don't. 2, you're going to want to score the contested objective near your spawn point. And the reason you really want to score that one is because you're not that likely to hemorrhage it back up. And so you're not likely to lose the 3 points based on like getting got on an objective that you've already controlled, right? Losing an objective, losing you an additional 3 points. You're not likely to lose those 3 points, and so that's why scoring it really early is just a really good advantage to you. You also want to prevent your opponent from scoring their spawn point objective for every reason in which it's really nice to score your sort of contested spawn objective. It's reinforcement objective. It's just as good to prevent your opponent from getting that free point, and it can be kind of dicey to actually go and score it, but if you can put a body on there to prevent your opponent from scoring it, that's pretty good. The 4th goal is going to be to seize advantage in the upcoming round 2 fights. It's going to be almost impossible to fight your opponent round 1. You just start so far away from each other. It's absurd how far away this mission starts you from each other, which it should be noted, massively benefits swarm warbands. So that is one sort of downside of Swamp Raid is because there's not a lot of time to fight. I mean, look how far away these hammers start, right? Because each warband won't be fighting all that much, that's a huge benefit to warbands with a lot of bodies or warbands with the ability to sort of present a lot of bodies through the dispossessed objective ability, things like that. So you are going to want to be able to seize advantage in the fights that do come up. So you're going to want to place your best offensive threats in position to get a kill in the first activation of round 2, if possible. And you're going to want to, if you have shooting, either maybe you can wait out your opponent and then get shots in if they come in close enough to try to contest these middle objectives, or you want to just be able to set up for non-preventable kills round 2, right? So you want to be able to put your shooters kind of in this sort of safe zone. If you're blue, the safe zone is kind of in between this objective and where the 6 is, and if you're red, it's kind of over here. Hopefully you can see my mouse. You're going to want to put your people, you're going to want to put your people in these safe shooting zones where you can potentially get kills without getting run down right away, where your opponent would have to kind of put themselves in a dicey spot on objectives in order to try to run you down. If you can achieve 3 of those 4 objectives, you're probably going to go on to win. And so that can be a really great place to give yourself a tactical advantage without necessarily having to be a tactical genius. So these things, because there's a pretty limited number of game pieces and a limited amount of goals, you can really actually sort of solve the 100% correct path here, which is really cool because I don't think there's very many times in Warcry when you can for sure know that you have the perfect, the absolute perfect choice forward. And this is one of the few times. So how do we do that? How do we solve the absolutely optimal way to approach a mission like this? The first way is going to be to map it. So the first thing I like to map out is the space between deployments and objectives. So the first one, if you look at the green lines here from this blue dagger, are the distances from the deployment point to the contested objectives and the home. The home is essentially 0 inches, but it's actually 0.000001 inches, right? From your deployment point, you must be within 3, which means that you can't be right on the border, which means that, it's 3 inches from the side for the deployment point, another 9 inches from the side for the objective, which means 6 inches in between, which means you must be within 3 on one side, which means you will just barely not be within 3 on the other side. So that means a weight plus any kind of move gets you there. The green lines to the contested objective are 13.4 inches, which means if you subtract 6, so if you're as close as you can possibly be on your deployment, and then you sort of get as far as you can be from that contested objective, you can get 7.4 inches to get from one spot to another. So if you have move 4, you'll have kind of just over half an inch of wiggle room there. I also like to look at the round 2 distances to deploy or to objectives. So for example, these hammers to the opponent's home objective is 12.75. So if you get up as close as you can, you only have to move 6.75 to contest it. The distance to the sort of opponent's very difficult to take contested objective is 7.1 inches. So you can get there with a move 4 fighter. The last thing to think about is the map distance, so the ones from objective to objective, and this is 8.48 inches between objectives. One interesting thing about that is 2.48 is a very difficult gap to double cap. So for example, 2.5 inches is 63 millimeters, which means that actually something like a mega boss actually can't even double cap that, which means only cavalry can double cap these objectives. So that's a very important thing to know. It is sort of a reason to bring some cavalry. A lot of cavalry are on 72 millimeter bases and they can double cap these objectives, but it's not something that necessarily you have to worry about, but it is a relevant thing about cavalry in this mission. So let's talk about what that means. So in round one, you can wait and move once and you can get onto your home objective. You can even have a fighter kind of in your backfield a little bit that can wait as long as the front of its base is just slightly past the deployment point. You can have, if you have a crowded objective point, if you have like a lot of fighters, you can get a fighter from your deployment to the objective, even if it's in the back, which is great. One thing though, you have to have move 4 to contest an objective. And if there's terrain in your way, move 4 actually won't be enough necessarily, depending on where the terrain is. So that's a very important thing to think about, where the ability to get to move 5 somewhere in your dagger is actually very important. Whether it's a move 4 fighter that you plan to rush, or whether it's just kind of having native move 5. So if you are playing dwarves or something, you're going to be in trouble if you only have dwarves in your dagger. You're going to need an ally there, or else you're probably going to lose this mission. And so that's just a very important thing to think about, because, you know, if you do have all dwarves and you rush, technically you do have move 4. You could potentially get to these objectives, but move 4 fighters are really at the mercy of terrain as far as whether they can make it. And so if you're rushing just to get to move 4, you're going to be in trouble. You're probably not going to get there. So that's just an important thing to think about, and a reason why you can't really play dwarves on this mission unless you have allies. Round 2 distances, again, move 3 cannot contest opposing objectives without move abilities. So you're going to want allies if you have a move 3 warband. This mission in general, I think, is designed to nerf dwarves and Nurgle and anything slow. It doesn't succeed on all those accounts. So for example, Soulblight Gravelords doesn't worry at all, because a double gets them +3 move instead of just +2, which is going to be enough to deal with the terrain. But it succeeds against most move 3 forces. So that's something to really think about when you think about what you're trying to do with this mission. Now, one thing about the map distance, though, is yes, it's only 2.5 inches. So that means any fighter that's on a border between objectives can wait and then switch objectives. Now, this is actually something that once big move 3 swarms like Soulblight Gravelords, or you could do this with KO, for example. You could do this. You can still do this with Nurgle. Once a move 3 swarm does get into position, they can do the really powerful thing of just like wait and then disengage onto a different objective that they're currently on, something like that, which is very powerful and something that you want to be able to think about. So now that you've kind of thought about sort of what this map allows, I want to put it into practice with a little bit more specifics. And so we're going to take a couple lists that have done very well in tournaments, and we are going to kind of set them up on the board virtually and kind of show what's going on and what their options are. The first is the second place list from TTS January, which has 2 Rat Ogres and then a bunch of utility Skaven. This Skaven list is a little different than the most common Skaven lists that you'll see doing really well in tournaments, because it only has one 70-point fighter that it can resurrect for free, but it's also similar in that it has 2 Rat Ogres. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Then TTS League for February was won by Iron Golems that were just all in on attack blessings. And so there are 2 Ogre Breachers with Ferocity here, and then just some utility golems walking around. There's Armators, which are very good fighty for their costs, and then everything here fights or has toughness 5. So these lists are kind of trying to achieve very different things, which I think makes it kind of interesting on this mission. So here's a setup of how they could be, and the first thing you want to think about with sort of what's going to happen as a round plays out is, how is the waiting game going to play out? And the reason I think that it's the first thing you want to think about, unless you play Iron Jaws, is because a mistake that I see a lot of players make, and I've made this mistake a couple times as well, is waiting with a few fighters that they actually can't afford to wait with, or waiting with some fighters when their opponent is actually going to be the one who wins the waiting game. So you should know what happens if I wait with a fighter. What are my opponent's tools to either wait with me, or are they even bothered by the activation change that has happened here? So, for example, both teams here want their ogre, which is represented here by the big bases, uh, want their ogre to be able to go first or to go last, right? To be able to choose what it's going to do. However, if Skaven wins initiative, even if the Armator waits before it activates, Skaven are still going to have the last two moves, right? So if Skaven wins, they go, you go first, Armator waits, Skaven gets to move or wait, and then the Armator goes, and then Skaven gets to go with a little guy, and then no matter what, the Rat Ogre is going to go after the Ogre Breacher, no matter what the Iron Golems player does. And so that means that, you know, if the Iron Golems player is waiting with their Armator just for the hell of it, that's fine, right? If they're planning on putting their Armator at their home objective anyway, then that's a fine time to wait. But if they're waiting with the hopes of creating the big advantage for their Ogre Breacher, they're probably not going to do that. And so you may want to consider whether or not you actually want to be waiting here with your Armator. If you think your Armator could be better used getting onto an objective that isn't your home objective, you're really not going to want to wait, and you're going to kind of waste time if you try to do that, and you're going to actually shrink your own options more than your opponent's. So it can be tempting to wait here, but not every good opener, in my opinion, would involve a wait. That's if Skaven wins objectives. If IG wins objective, then all of a sudden waiting becomes a little bit more possible. You create a few more options for yourself. Because for the Rat Ogre to go last, if your Armator waits, they're going to have to wait once to make it so that their Rat Ogre goes last. So now all of a sudden, the Armator creates real value for you if you wait with it in a way that it wouldn't have created value if Skaven won initiative. So that's something to think about with the wait wars, as far as will you actually win them, and don't engage in them unless you're going to win them, unless you're going to actually cost your opponent something by waiting. So if you win initiative here, you can't quote unquote win the war by waiting with your Armator, because Skaven just has more bodies than you, but you can force them to have an actual cost, to pay a real cost to wait on their own, and that can give you way more options than the other way. So waiting becomes very powerful if you've won initiative, and it's very bad for you if the Skaven win initiative. So if we do play it out, right, Skaven are probably, no matter what happens, there's a good chance they're going to wait either with Hungering Skaven or with Creep. Those are the fighters that are in their dagger. If we look here, the Skaven dagger has Rat Ogre, Creepkin Whisper, and Hungering Skaven, and the Iron Golems have Ogre Breacher and Armator. That's the Armator is a little 15 wound dwarf that has a surprisingly good attack profile. So if you're Iron Golems, you are the team that has fewer options really to think about. And so with only two options, you kind of have to commit with your first activation. And because you have to commit, you don't get this read and react playstyle. If you try to play that way while you are down on activations, then you will lose. Your opponent will just be able to play your game better than you're playing it. So when you are going to lose the wait wars and you have fewer options than your opponent, then you need to be the one who proactively commits to a game plan. And so, in my opinion, Iron Golems really only has three options here, and I'll kind of map them out and show why. But you can really choose, as long as you sort of definitively go with one of these early, then you're going to be fine. And I don't really know without testing it out which of these is better in this matchup, but it will show you kind of, good answers to figure out later which one is the best answer. So the first one is a traditional opener. And I call it traditional because you're just taking your home objective and then you are attacking. So you are just playing a little bit of defense and a little bit of offense at the same time. First, you'll wait with your Arbiter. Um, like I said before, if they win initiative, the wait with the Arbiter doesn't really get you that much, but it's not like it gets you nothing. And the place you're moving to, you don't need more than 3 inches of movement anyway. And so why not wait? It allows your opponent to just like make an embarrassingly silly error just in case they're going to. They probably won't, but who knows? Maybe they're fairly new and then you get some value that way. You wait with your Arbiter, then you move it up 3 inches. You're going to want to put it, make sure it's outside of 11 of the Rat Ogre, which isn't too much of an issue here. And you're going to want to put it in a place where if your opponent wants to bum rush this objective with their hammer, that the Arbiter is kind of in the way to where you're going to have a very good chance of being able to get an attack in. So they're so fast that you're not going to be able to body block them off the objective, but if you position yourself in a place where it's very difficult for them to get onto the objective without being within 1 inch of you, then depending on how things play out elsewhere on the board, you might be able to get some attacks in with your Arbiter, which would be really nice. So you just want to be sort of setting up future engagements this way and thinking about how your opponent is going to kind of lay siege to you. Then you're going to want to move your Ogre Breacher, sort of almost regardless of what they do. The only way you wouldn't then move your Ogre Breacher to this position is if they did something really silly, like if they said to themselves, like, oh, I'm going to go contest your home objective, and that's going to steal a point from you, because like Skaven are really fast, so I've seen some Skaven players get distracted by how fast they are and just try to go do reckless, way across the board stuff just because they can. And, if they make that ridiculous, unforced error, then you can kind of go after them. Or like they might rush their Rat Ogre to try to bring it in so that, if one of these was a Packmaster, they're not. They're Creep, Kin Whisper, and Hungering Skaven, which are 2 Underworlds models. But if one was a Packmaster, sometimes you'll see a Skaven player like rush their Rat Ogre to get 12 inches across the board and then run in a Packmaster to then get a single attack in. And if they do something dumb like that, then you can just come in and attack them with your Ogre Breacher. But most likely they're not going to do something dumb like that. Most likely they're going to be trying to score points. And that is why you do wait. Even if you can't win the wait war, if it doesn't cost you anything, you'll still wait just in case they make a crazy mistake. Then your Ogre Breacher is going to want to go as far as it possibly can go down into this objective to get as close as it can to the opponent's shield. And the reason you want to do that is because your Ogre Breacher hits really freaking hard. And so you want it as close to being into combat as it can possibly be for round 2. And so you're going to want to rush it to get it to move 5 to be able to get kind of deep into this area here so that maybe your opponent has to, depending on how many guys they have in their shield, they might even have to deploy in combat with it, or maybe pretty close to being in combat with it, so that you can really easily get attacks in and get a kill early in round 2, which can really benefit you later on. So you're going to want to just move your Breacher down really quickly, and that's kind of just the opener that you're really going to do almost regardless of what your opponent does, unless your opponent makes a terrible mistake. And so the one gamble here that you're really thinking about is, can your Arbiter deter your opponent's hammer? In this situation, it's a Gun Roger and Chaff. So if you can get near terrain for cover against the Gun Roger, that's going to be really good for you. Otherwise, it's just like a little Skaven model that can't fight the Arbiter. So your Arbiter actually does have a chance. If they just both walk onto the objective, you will lose it the first round, but they'll spend 2 turns moving, and then you'll get to get 2 attacks in. An Arbiter probably isn't killing a Rat Ogre with 2 attacks, but you could kill the Chaff piece, and then hopefully get support. If they're putting all these eggs into this basket, your Ogre Breachers that come on from your or you have a scary model coming on both, right? Because you have your Ogre Breacher coming on in your hammer, and you have the Dominar in your shield. If they spend a ton of resources sieging your home deployment here, you can maybe get your Dominar into the area while your sort of other folks get to actually attack. So something you can do, but it is a bit of a gamble because it does leave your opponent able to kind of siege you fairly well. Another option, if you're really worried about that, is to do what I call a deployment rush, where, by the way, this is way easier if you win initiative, but where your Ogre Breacher just charges into where your opponent is going to spawn. And even though your Ogre Breacher isn't scoring an objective here, you are forcing your opponent to open up in combat with you, and then ideally your Ogre Breacher just kills the Rat Ogre first activation of round 2, and then you're not even worried about how the rest of it goes because your opponent is down so many points, and you plan to make up those activations later when your Ogre Breacher finally migrates its way onto an objective after preventing your opponent's scoring points. The reason it's way easier if Iron Golems win initiative is if Skaven sniff it out, they can actually sort of prevent you from even scoring a single objective because they can kind of rush creep 14 inches, and so they can score 1, score 2, and score more and have you not even score 1. And they can do something like wait with Hungering Skaven, you move up with Armator, then they if they then move Hungering Skaven and then you deployment rush, then they can still have Hungering Skaven here, they can get their Rat Ogre here, and then they can run over to this objective with creep and get in here so that you score none, they score 2, which means they get the bonus point and they win 3-0 on the mission. That still might be worth it for you, but it's just way easier. If you win an initiative, you make them go first, then you move your guy, then they can do that. The one reason why I have you kind of walking over here is it's going to be, you're spending so much resources trying to stop your opponent sieging your home objective that you're really going to want to put your Armator into a position where it can actually defend this objective later. So that's why you're going to move your Armator here. This is a very high-risk plan that I don't suggest for most of the time, but the one thing that's nice about it is if you're 3 bodies down anyway, and you need to guarantee that you're going to be in combat, like if you're just going to lose, if you're planning on being the underdog and you think you're going to lose unless you get early combats and those combats go well, then this can be a way to kind of force some combats and stop your opponent from getting to dance around you, which can be very good. This is only something really that you do if you think that you're a massive underdog in this fight, but that can still be worth it. The last one is kind of a risk-reward play. Basically, the idea is, again, you know that you are behind here, so you just drop your ballast and run. Basically, you are deciding that you can't hold your home objective because your opponent is just going to take it at the beginning of round 2 anyway. That was kind of the big gamble I said of the traditional opening. This is the opening that a lot of players will figure out to do most of the time. The big drawback is completely mitigated here, although there are other gambles that you're taking. So, for example, you're not even taking your home objective with your 2 little guys because you know that you can't hold it. And so what you're going to do is you're going to put your Armator over here, which is an objective you know you can hold. You're going to measure out the threat range of the Rat Ogre so that you don't end in a place where it can hit you. The Rat Ogre has a 10-inch threat range. Because you've mapped out the board, you know that it can cover, an 11-inch threat range. It can cover just past the objective, but it can't cover all the way past the contesting range. So you're going to move your Armator onto contesting this objective, and then you're going to move your Ogre Breacher is his name. You're going to move him as deep as you can into opposing territory on the other contested objective. There's a very good chance that your opponent will be able to just take this objective from you round 1, but at least here you are sort of putting a big investment into two objectives that you know you can end the game with, and you're just hoping to win fights so badly that eventually in round 4 you migrate over to these objectives you had no chance to hold, and you take them and score the bonus points there. I think this is a really interesting opener. The one gamble is you need to have a backup plan for if you don't have two doubles, because this Ogre Breacher, if it doesn't have a double, it's not getting very deep into opposing territory, so it might not be able to start round 1 and have an easy time choosing what it fights, which would be too bad. And so you really want two doubles to make this work, and two doubles is the most common roll in Warcry, but you're going to want to plan for if you don't get an initiative roll that has two doubles, because you won't be able to execute this. So I think if I were playing Iron Golems, I'd play a practice game and see how things try to play out with me doing this, but I would be very tempted to actually abandon my home objective and just go for both of these. I think all three of these are very defensible, but doing anything that's kind of halfway is not. And so that's why I think you want to really think about what your openers are, and playing a sensible opener that isn't the best, most optimal opener is so much better than just playing a not sensible opener. Like the difference between whichever one of these three is best and the other two is so much smaller than the difference between whichever one of these is the third best and the fourth best thing you can be doing. And so that's why it's really good to kind of map these missions out and plan them out. On the Skaven side, because you get a completely different challenge, right? Because you have a ton of movement and you have more bodies. The world is your oyster here. And you get to be almost as fighty as Iron Golem. You're a huge overdog, right? So what you're going to want to do is read and then react. You can wait, and you have a bit of a decision here of waiting with either hungering or creep. You definitely want to, don't just wait randomly with one or the other. If you wait with hungering Skaven, you're going to get a shot in with creep, which is really great if you want it. Or you can wait with creep and then move it over. And then you can get hungering Skaven to tie up your opponent's Ogre Breacher. And it's really nice if your opponent's Ogre Breacher is killing something that you can resurrect in round 2, as opposed to killing something else, right? So if you wait with creep, then you get to see what your opponent is eventually going to do with the Ogre Breacher, and you get to then tie it up. That requires you to move your Rat Ogre kind of earlier, so you might not get maximum value there, but you can just kind of hold that plan in reserve. And then you get to kind of decide, do I want my Rat Ogre coming in to try to beat up the opponent's Dominar? That can be pretty good. That's something that you would do if you had a Pack Master or a Master Molder in your hammer. In this case, you don't, so I'd probably put my Rat Ogre actually over here, and I'd do something else with creep. But basically, you get to actually plan things out kind of depending on what your opponent does, and so you get to play the control role and kind of the aggressor role too at the same time, because you could just rush and get 14 inches over and actually get onto the opponent's home objective. So because you are the warband with more fighters and faster fighters, you don't need to be the one making a proactive play in order to win. You get to try to do whatever is most flexible to you. And so you just want to make sure, if you can, you want to get your Rat Ogre into a position where it can fight things that aren't an Ogre Breacher, because the Ogre Breacher will beat up the Rat Ogre and then you'll lose 240 points for nothing. And you want to be able to make sure you're outscoring your opponent at all times. So you're going to kind of just put things over here unless your opponent does something crazy and puts, say, their Armator inside 11 inches of your Rat Ogre, in which case you're just going to run over and pounce and deal it some damage. So let's talk about how all that goes. So the first is, how do we expand this to more complex deployments, right? The same heuristics apply, but there's just a few more pieces. So your big things want to have the most possible options, which means you're usually going to move with your little things first. You are going to only engage in weight wars you can win, which means knowing if your opponent has one more fighter than you and you won initiative, you can make them go first, which means that waiting on your end can actually be very powerful. Otherwise, there are going to be, with more deployments, there's more big things on the board. And so if you have things where waiting costs you nothing, where you can wait and still get to an objective with a unit that doesn't want to be in combat, that's when waiting costs you nothing. Then you can wait and then move. And even if you're going to lose the wait war, it still kind of constrains your opponent's options slightly. Otherwise, you really don't want to be waiting. If you have, if your opponent's warband is not as fighty as you, and they have more bodies than you, I see a lot of people keep waiting a whole bunch past the point where it's no longer good, and you really want to get those movement actions going early so that you can get into combat later. Then you're just going to want to keep focusing on score and engagement setup. So anything that puts your fightiest pieces against pieces of your opponents that won't win those fights, that's going to be good. And so that's, any weight war you engage in is only in order to set up those two things, scoring the most points and setting up the best engagements. A question that I think any reasonable person could ask is, what do we do on this process for non-objective games? Well, for quarters games, anything where you score by being in quarters, you take the exact same process. But otherwise, instead of measuring from sort of deployments to objectives, you're really measuring from deployment to deployment. And you're still caring a lot about threat ranges, but that's what you're measuring that's actually it becomes the main thing you're measuring as opposed to the secondary. And so instead of thinking about sort of objective bubbles, you're thinking about threat range bubbles the most. And you're going to really want to think about your backups. So for example, Warcry is often a game about being the player who counterattacks, because if you come in and attack once, they get to attack twice. That's why something like a Gutlord is so good, because it allows no counterattack. It has range 2, so things it fails to kill often can't hit it in one or hit it twice, and it deals so much damage that it kills almost everything that it attacks, right? Gutlords shouldn't exist. This is a separate thing in the game. But in general, for most warbands, if you come in with a proactive attack, often your opponent is going to be able to counterattack. So you're going to want to make sure that you can easily bring forces to bear that can then counterattack the counterattack, essentially, and sort of make it so your opponent can't punish you as hard. The best warband in the game at this right now is Skaven, because they can come in, hit you, you hit them back, and then if you don't get the kill, they can come hit you again because of their pack masters. The other best warband at doing it is Wildercore, and all the warbands that do a bad impression of Wildercore, like Hunters of Huanchi or KO, or even certain Tzeentch builds, right? Those warbands can also do the same thing because shooting is so good in these non-objective games. Just generally, if there's a bunch of non-objective games, you should think about shooting a lot if you can. And in these games, you still really only want to engage in weight wars that you are winning, right? So if you are waiting a whole bunch and then if you're waiting a couple times and then you're not even getting the last activation, you can put yourself in a really bad spot where your most important thing is having to move without being able to dictate terms to the opponent's most important piece. But now you're moving into a place where you have no counterattacks set up behind you. Think of it like chess, right? You wouldn't move your queen into a space where you didn't have, a piece backing her up if she gets taken, right? And so if you move your most important piece into a spot where you have no one else to engage, and your opponent's most important piece is free, they can either get a free first hit on your most important thing, or they get to move, and take out other targets elsewhere. And you've been waiting so much that you don't have like the backup pieces in place, right? Whereas if you put pieces where, you move pieces up and then their big pieces can come take them, well, at least then you can come move and support with your biggest piece. So that's kind of convoluted, but basically the lesson is you should only be waiting with the things that can afford to wait, and anything that needs to be up in the opponent's face should not be waiting, even if it feels like a losing game because your opponent has activation advantage over you. They started with activation advantage. Don't think of it as like they're seizing it from you. A lot of people, I think, realize that they're going to lose the activation battle, and then they make it worse by trying to wait a lot so that they don't look stupid. But in those situations, you have to look stupid in order to have a chance, because your opponent can just like every weight that you do that your opponent can weight better, they're just beating you by even more. Even though you look smart because you are engaging in the battle that matters with the activation battle, you're actually making yourself worse off by doing it. So that's a lot to think about. Maybe I will do, if there's demand for it, I will do another video for those kind of non-objective games and how to kind of do those types of openers. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in that sort of thing. I would love for you to like and subscribe to this video. I always forget in my videos to talk about that, but please do. It helps support the channel. It helps push these types of videos out to people to let them know about kind of what's going on with this game. And these kind of tactical videos are not something we see very often. So, or like not something I do very often. And so, your feedback is definitely a big decider on whether or not I will try something like this again. So I hope you have some fun mapping out your next few battles. And until then, may all your rolls be crits.